one of the most, I think, amazing of the judges to talk about this evening. Very descriptive, very dramatic in the portrayal. And, you know, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to read through this and just see and imagine in your own mind exactly how things played out. It was certainly a very testing and trying time, yet again, in Israel's history. But yet again, God heard the pleas and the cries of his people. Now, last week, of course, or 2 weeks, actually I think it was 3 weeks ago, we did Othniel. And you will notice the previous verse to what we started our reading that Brother Ben read for us here, that it says in verse 11, and the land had rest 40 years, and then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So one could presume that during that 40 years, things were going along relatively smoothly and maybe in accordance with how God wanted them to react. Obviously, the idols were still there. There were many other aspects of wrongdoing probably still going on. But relatively speaking, God had given them 40 years of peace. And he wouldn't have given them 40 years of peace if they hadn't have been towing the line, so to speak. But Othniel, the son of Kenaz, dies, and then what next? Well, sadly, brothers and sisters and young people, that whole cycle starts all over again. It's a merry-go-round, isn't it, in the history of Israel? And, you know, goodness me, it's so applicable when we look at that cycle, brothers and sisters. We can see ourselves in that. Can you see yourself in that, brothers and sisters? You know, we're on this merry-go-round of sinning, and every now and again it slows down, and we seem to be just being able to cope with some of the bad habits of life, and then bang, that merry-go-round starts picking up again, and we're on this cycle of sin. And that's what God says is human nature. And somewhere along the line, we've got to try and address that and arrest it. We can't do it on our own. We need God's help. We're going to see tonight in this story of Ehud just exactly the method of which we can do that. So we do sometimes feel like we can't get off that merry-go-round. And here it is. It's happening all over again in verse 12. And the children of Israel, so after 40 years, they started doing evil again in the sight of Yahweh. And so Yahweh, it says, raises up King Eglon, strengthens Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel. Now, brothers and sisters, we need to pause for a moment. Let's just first of all just discuss Eglon. He was a character and a half. Maybe we should say 2.5, because he was a big man. He was a very big man. In fact, this is a very apt symbol I've put up here for Eglon. He was the king of Moab. His name means a young male bull. He was a big man. In fact, verse 17 says Eglon was a very fat man. When you look at that Hebrew word, very fat, it asks you to emphasise it loud. Eglon was a very huge fat man. He was massive. I would love to be in a photo shoot next to him because he would make me look anorexic, and that's saying something, all right? I'm serious. He was a massive man, and the Word of God is very explicit in telling us that, because the whole story revolves around the size of this man and what actually happened to him. He was a very fat man. So his meaning means a young bull, and he was a king, and it says that God strengthened him. And it says, first of all, before we deal with that, he gathered unto himself, in verse 13, the children of Ammon and Amalek. Now, these are the two most hated enemies of Israel, the Ammonites and the Amalekites. God hated them. The people hated them. The Moabites were obviously in charge of them as well, under the reign of this King Eglon, king of Moab. And for 18 years, it tells us, for 18 years in verse 14, this king made life absolute misery for the Israelites because they got back onto that merry-go-round of sinning. And they went down that path of doing the wrong thing. And the interesting thing is it says God strengthened Eglon. That seems a little incongruous, doesn't it? It seems a little unfair. It just doesn't seem quite right that God would actually strengthen people he hated. He hated them. But he strengthens them against his own people. Why did he do that, brothers and sisters? Why did he do that in verse 12? He strengthened Eglon. Why does God allow all these nations? This is not the first time it happened, nor will it be the last time. It happened, even the days of Othniel, he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. So it's not, the Mesopotamians, it's not uncommon in the story of the Judges for God to do this. Why does he do it? Well, if you just cast your eyes back to Judges 2, verse 20 to 23, on the same page virtually of your open Bible there, you've got the reasons why God's done this. He was extraordinarily angry with Israel, continually going down this track of sinning, doing all the depraved things that they were involved in, and there was a reason why they were doing that. And he says in verse 20, look, the anger of Yahweh was hot against Israel. He said, because that this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers. They haven't listened to me. What was that command? Well, we looked at that in our first class, didn't we? The command was, you get rid of all the people that are in the land. All the foreign nations that are in the land, you get rid of all of them. Get them out of that land, because if you leave even just one nation there or one group of people there that are wrong in their worship and absolute blasphemous and immoral, he said, if you leave them there, it's like the one bad apple ruins the whole lot. Well, if you leave them there, you're going to end up being like them. And we know the outcome from the book of Judges, that they left them there. They didn't overcome all of them. Sure, they had a few battles and they pushed people out, but primarily, as we saw in chapter 1 and 2, they left the people, the nations, the surrounding nations there. So what does God say? He says, verse 21, I also will not henceforth drive out any of them before you. If you think I'm going to do it for you and you're not going to lift a finger to do it, well, I'm not going to help you either. They can stay there as far as I'm concerned, God says, and they're going to stay there for a reason. Verse 22, that through them, so this is through Eglon, this is through Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. It's through the Philistines. It's through all those nations that they left there. Through them, I may test you out. I'm going to test you out. You don't want to lift a finger and get the job done properly? Well, I'm going to leave them there too. I'm not going to get rid of them. I'm going to leave them there, and they are going to be a thorn in your side, and they will test you out to see whether you keep the way of Yahweh or not. And then verse 23, therefore Yahweh left those nations without driving them out hastily, neither delivered he them into the hand of Joshua. They were left for a purpose, and that purpose was to test his people. And so when Eglon comes along, God does give him a little bit of extra strength, because his people needed testing, very much so. They needed a great deal of testing to see whether or not they were prepared to come back to the way of God. And so Eglon, for 18 years, with the Moabites, with the Ammonites, with the Amalekites, caused a lot of misery for Israel. Now, if you want to know the areas of the Judges and where they operated on, and particularly tonight we're talking about Ehud, there they are listed there. Of course, Barak and Deborah. Deborah should be really listed up there, not Barak. But that's the area there that we are talking about, where all the judges did their work as far as judging or delivering the children of Israel out of their time of trouble. And the area of Ehud is down there by the city of Jericho, the city of palm trees, and that's where he's going to deal with this fat man, this King Sin. He's an absolute terrific description of King Sin. And he's in charge. He's absolutely in charge. Just to get you a little bit closer to where we're talking about, there's Jericho. Keep in mind that little town there called Gilgal, which is not far from Jericho. So this is the area that we're talking about where Ehud does his deliverance work. And of course the mountains of Ephraim were also mentioned here in Judges chapter 3. Now you'll notice that it says in verse 13 that he smote Israel and he possessed the city of palm trees. Now who can tell me what the city of palm trees is? Jericho, exactly. Jericho. The city of palm trees. Now, the city of palm trees, the reason why it was known as palm trees, because there was water there. It was a terrific little oasis in the wilderness. You go there today and there's still water at that particular area. There is underground aquifers. Jericho has still got palm trees growing in that area. It is a very pleasant little area amongst a pretty isolated desert sort of surrounds. And Ammon and Amalek and all the allies that were with the king of Moab, they had victory over Israel, and King Eglon set up his headquarters here, his regional rule, from Jericho. Now, you're probably like me saying, well, hang on a second. Didn't Jericho get destroyed? Probably about 60 years prior to this event, Jericho was destroyed. How come he's back in Jericho? I thought it got destroyed. It did get destroyed. We know it got destroyed in the crossing of the Jordan, and the first city that they came across, or the second city, Jericho, and they came across there and they destroyed that particular city. But, brothers and sisters, it wasn't fully rebuilt until the days of Ahab. Because remember, there was a curse pronounced upon anyone that would rebuild the city of Jericho would be cursed. And of course, in the days of Ahab, it was rebuilt by a man by the name of Heel, and he did suffer that curse. He lost children as a result of rebuilding Jericho. But how come Eglon's here? Was it's just ruins and he set his camp here? Well, we don't know the exact answer. What we do know is that he never rebuilt the whole city. He must have just rebuilt a part of it and established his summer parlour there, his summer little palace there. He loved the area far better than where he came from because there was water there. It must have been a very attractive place to set up his summer residence and to be able to control the rest of Israel from that vantage point. So it served as a great medium for him. I don't believe he rebuilt it because he would have suffered the curse, but I'm sure that he must have had a substantial little residence there whereby he was able to control Israel. So the scene is set for this man to come to the rescue, and his name is Ehud. Ehud, we know him as the left-handed judge. There's a reason why he succeeded in his mission being a left-handed man, as we'll explain in a moment. His name means strong or united. Strong or united. He was of the tribe of Benjamin, the enemy at the time of the Moabites. There were 18 years of oppression, and as a result of his rescue mission, they ended up having 80 years of peace. So this is a pretty substantial rescue effort that's going to happen. It has a long period of time of peace. And of course, we're going to see this story here is not just about Ehud, it's not just about Eglon, it's not just about Israel or the enemy. It has far-reaching ramifications and lessons for you and me today, 2017. So as we said, his name means united. He was a Benjamite. You know something, brothers and sisters? Ehud is very fortunate to even be alive. And the reason why we say that is because the entire tribe was nearly wiped out in almost a civil war that took place in chapters 20 and 21. You're going to say, well, that's way down the track. Well, no, at first class we established that the last 4 chapters of the book of Judges actually happened prior to these judges coming on the scene. And that's why the whole nation of Israel were in absolute bitter trouble in all facets of religion and of political upheaval, of the tribes and what was going on amongst them all. They were in absolute dire trouble. And brothers and sisters, the 2 chapters, and particularly the chapter 19, talks about the concubine and the Levite and what happened in that particular very, very nasty incident. And the result of that, of course, was the other tribes, the remaining tribes other than Benjamin, sought to get some sort of answers from Benjamin. So they all rolled up to the tribe of Benjamin, where they were ensconced in their particular tribal area, and they had a major fight. And I'm talking a major fight, brothers and sisters. 80,000 people lost their life. This was a civil war amongst the ecclesia of God. 80,000 people. 50,000 of those 80,000 were of the tribe of Benjamin. And that's all listed for us in chapters 20 and 21. And it just so happens that they were almost wiped out, the tribe of Benjamin, except for 600 men. 600 were left. And 600 of those surviving men, of course, were left and able to be able to back out of the fighting that was going on. The rest of the tribes let them go. They talked to God about all this. They made some ridiculous covenants about not allowing their daughters to marry these men, and all sorts of ramifications were evolving over all that, and it gets quite complicated how they were able to get wives and how they were able to produce offspring. But the point we're making is Ehud was of that tribe. He's lucky to even be there. He was obviously born, I believe, into one of these particular tribes. I don't think he was old enough to be a part of this particular battle. I don't think he was an old man. I think he was a relatively young man, as we sort of would indicate from the amount of journeying he does and how he leads a battle into a party into battle and so on. So Ehud, the second judge, was probably born amongst those survivors of the tribe of Benjamin. So God raises up a judge from the most cursed and hated tribes of that era. The rest of the tribes hated Benjamin. As we said, they nearly wiped them out. They lost a lot of men trying to do that. But this was a man who was a very valiant man, and he was an honourable man, and he was a man of God. And people have the ability, brothers and sisters, to stand up for good no matter what background they come from. Doesn't matter what background they come from. They have the ability to stand up for good, and that's exactly what Ehud does. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, he's a left-handed man. Now, does anyone know what the natural ability of the Benjamites were? That's it. They could sling a stone out of a sling with great accuracy, enormous accuracy. But Ehud doesn't use that trait in this story. It's not even mentioned that he even has a sling. There's no mention whatsoever he has a sling. He has something far greater that he is making for himself in the background that is going to deliver and rescue Israel and is going to have great ramifications and lessons right throughout history. Ehud, it says in verse 16, he makes himself a dagger which has two edges, a cubit in length, and he did gird it upon under his raiment upon his right thigh. Now, that's the best I could get to maybe what it looked like. It was about 18 inches long, or if you're in the new school, from a lot of our younger ones here, say 500 mil long, all right, half a metre, not quite. It's a fairly big dagger. It's almost a sword, but it's a cubit in length, and a cubit is generally from your elbow to your top of your hand, all right? So it's a pretty lengthy, it's not just a little dagger, it's not a little flick knife, it's a serious weapon. But what made it even more serious is it was a two-edged dagger. That is, and obviously that didn't seem to be the run-of-the-mill type sword. The run-of-the-mill type sword was probably one major edge that was cut and thrust, and that was it. This one, no, two edges, two very sharp edges on this particular sword. Now, being a left-handed man, of course, he would strap that sword to his right thigh. Now, in doing so, he probably escaped the attention of anybody taking a look for weapons that they normally would look on the left-hand side. Because majority of people being right-handed, they would draw their sword or their knife or whatever they had or their weapon, they would draw it from their left-hand side. So people weren't openly looking on the right-hand side of Ehud. And he's got this whole plan ready to enact out that he might be able to rescue Israel. And of course, this sword, being a two-edged sword, was extraordinarily deadly. It was going to be very precise. It was going to be very, very accurate. So in verse 15, we read the latter part there that there was a group of people that obviously got together to send the King Eglon a present. And by him, that is Ehud, the children of Israel sent a present unto Eglon, the king of Moab. Now, I wonder what sort of present they actually sent. You would give King Eglon food. All right? So they probably, and that was pretty readily available to them, I would gather, that they wanted to bring him a gift. It could have also been, as some have suggested, an annual or some sort of periodical tax that they had to bring, and they bought it not so much in the form of money, because it says it was a gift, it wasn't actually money, a present for him. So I'm suggesting that they probably bought him the best food that they could get. And it took a few people to bring it. So he was pretty happy when he saw all this food probably coming into his greeting hall that he probably had. And in comes the children of Israel. Ehud's leading the way. By him, it says, they sent this present, and they bring it in and they present it. And Ehud's got this two-edged sword on the right side of his thigh. No one notices it. The guards don't even see it. And he walks in. He's now in the presence of this great big fat man with all of this food, and he's got the opportunity to rescue Israel. He's won the king over already. King's got a grin from ear to ear. He's got all this food in front of him. He doesn't realise it, but he's got an assassin right there in front of him as well. So the stage is set, brothers and sisters and young people. You know, the king could have been killed then and there. But suddenly something doesn't go according to plan. It doesn't work out the way that we all thought maybe it could have happened. Now, I'm not sure what happens next and why what happens next actually happens. I can't give you the definitive answer. We can only speculate, because you see in verse 17, he's there, he's in front of the king, he's given the present, he's got the sword on his thigh, he's right at that cusp of the moment where he could pull out that sword and kill the king. But it doesn't happen. So they bring the gift in verse 17. They brought the present unto Eglon, king of Moab, and Eglon was a very fat man. And when he had made an end to offer the present, that's Ehud, Eglon then sends everybody away, sends all the people away that bear the present. So Ehud says, "Go, great king, here's the gift." And all this food, like on a banquet table, is all piled up there, just like that. It just would have looked so tempting for the king. And at that moment, the king says, "Righto, everybody get out." And that included Ehud, because he went out. Because verse 19 says he's off. He's out of there. He takes off, brothers and sisters, and he walks from Jericho, and he's walking north, and he's walking 6 kilometres towards Gilgal. I wonder what he was thinking, brothers and sisters. Why didn't he get the job done back there on the first introduction to the king? What went wrong? Why wasn't the job accomplished? He walked 6 kilometres, and then suddenly he gets to this very deliberate spot, geographical spot in Israel, where everything just suddenly stops, and he turns around and he races back to the king, to the palace, to the summer parlour, as is how where we're going to find him. So he gets to a place called Gilgal. Now, in the margin here, it says there were quarries that were there, and you look in your margin, it says there were graven images, and there may well have been, and they probably were Israel's graven images. Maybe they were Moabites, but don't forget this is Israeli territory here. So perhaps these are graven images, and you could imagine Ehud getting there and going, "Oh, look at these jolly images. We've got to get this job done. The job's not finished. The job's not accomplished." I don't reckon that was the reason why he turned around. I reckon he would have seen plenty of images all throughout Israel. I don't think he turned around because of that. Brothers and sisters, something else happened at Gilgal. What else happened at Gilgal? Probably maybe 60 to 90 years before this event. What happened? I wonder what happened at Gilgal. Something very special took place there. Sorry? May well have, that's not my answer, but yep. There's something, yeah, there was too, that did happen, but that's not exactly what I'm thinking of. There's something else. Yes, crossing the Jordan, going across into Israel, there were the stones, the memorial stones that were set up. 2 lots of stones. One was set up in the middle of the river, and the river rolled back over those, and then they were also told to take 12 more stones and put them as a memorial at Gilgal. It tells us that in Joshua 4. We haven't got time to look it up, but Joshua chapter 4, verses 19 to 24, they set up 12 stones taken out of the river Jordan to commemorate the crossing into the promised land, and it happened to be at Gilgal. Now, I'm not suggesting the stones were still there. Maybe they were, I don't know. But you know what? Those stones were entrenched into the minds of every Israelite for probably generations. And the reason we know that is because God said in Joshua chapter 4, in verse 24, he says, I want you to tell all your children about this memorial set up of 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel. I want you to tell all your people, and here's what it's going to represent, that all peoples of the earth may know that the hand of Yahweh is mighty, that you may fear Yahweh your God forever. And this is the exact spot that Ehud gets. He hasn't finished the mission. He's still got his dagger that he's made. He gets to that spot. He's thinking to himself, I haven't finished the mission. I haven't finished the mission. And bang, he gets right here, and he would remember his mum and dad telling him all about the story of the crossing of the River Jordan and what it's the significance of what it actually meant. And in essence, it means the hand of God is working with you if you love and fear him. It's not going to be Ehud's hand on this sword, brothers and sisters. It's going to be, yes, it will be his hand, but clasped around his hand is the mighty hand of Yahweh. And I think this really would have clicked with Ehud. Now, the question still remains, why didn't he act when he had the first opportunity? I don't know the answer to that. Perhaps he could assess the timing wasn't right. Perhaps he knew that there was another half to this battle, and it wasn't just about killing the king. And the way things were here, he needed to make sure he had a clean getaway, and it didn't seem to present itself. Maybe that was the case. Or perhaps he panicked. Perhaps he got shortness of breath and thought, oh, can I go through with this? I don't know. I don't want to speculate too much and put Ehud in a bad light because he was chosen by God. But you know what, brothers and sisters, we all do that. We all do that, brothers and sisters. You know, we want to make a stand for the truth in our lives sometimes, and we're determined to do it, and then suddenly we get sidetracked because it just doesn't quite work out. The timing's not quite right to do something we want to do in our life. And when we get sidetracked and we lose sight of that end goal. You ever been in that position, brothers and sisters? And so we don't make that stand that we know we should have. And it's not until we get to a certain point in our life that suddenly something happens and it turns us around. And we get back on course. We get back on track. It jolts us into some sort of reality. And maybe that's what happened here. Again, I don't really know. All I know is he turned around at Gilgal and he comes back to the king's palace. He's got a job to finish and he hasn't finished it yet. So he wants to head back there. So he gets back to the king's palace. And this time the record tells us the king's in a different area. Now he's in the summer parlour. The summer parlour. He's now in a different, more private area. It's built for himself. And this summer parlour, brothers and sisters, it's secluded. It's cool, it offers some breezes coming through the windows, and it's got its own private toilet. So he's got this magnificent little spot that he himself can just recline and relax. He's got his own ensuite, and he's there now because I don't think they all brought the food into this place because the record tells us that this parlour was built for himself in verse 20. This summer parlour, it was really just for him. He gets back. Now, there's no guards going to worry about it because he was only there a few hours earlier. He only went 5-6 kilometres away. And he comes back maybe 3 hours or so. And they all go, what are you doing back? He says, I've got a little message for the king. It's a very secret one. That's what he says in verse 19. He says, I have a secret errand unto thee, O king. So the king is there, the guards are there, the servants are all there. He says, oh, boy, have I got a secret for you. Shh! Don't tell me now, Ehud. Tell me in private. You know, this is now setting the stage for everything that had to happen the right possible way. Tell me in private, he says. So he sends everybody that's around him out of the room. And then we get to verse 20. Now, there's almost a little bit of humour in this, and I don't want to this is pretty dramatic what actually happens here, and I don't want to try and lighten it too much, but there does seem to be a little bit of humour here, because we got this enormous, gigantic person like a fat kid in a lolly shop, all right? He's just probably gourmetised himself with all this food and he's relaxing. And now he's very proud, arrogant man. He's got itching ears that are tickling, because if you notice in verse 20, he says, I've got a message for you. You know what? This is a message from God, the God of Israel. God of Israel wants to talk to me. He wants to talk to me, it says. Oh, everyone out of the room. Come over. And this is an opportunity for Ehud to get close. Only whisper it in my ear. He doesn't say that, but he says, don't, shh, yeah, Ehud, don't say it out loud. Come closer. Now the whole stage is set, brothers and sisters, for the rescuing mission to start. And in verse 21, here it is. He gets very close to the king. The king rises, this great big bulk of a man, gets out of his lounge chair, his recliner, and he struggles to get to his feet. He's an excited person. The God of Israel wants to talk to me, wants to tell me a message. This is the most fascinating thing I've heard. And Ehud put forth his left hand, took the dagger from his right thigh and thrust it deep into his belly. That undetected two-edged sword, that dagger rather, that may as well have been a sword, that he made was finally used. And verse 22, the dagger was so sharp and it went in so deep that the haft, that is the little cross bit on the dagger, the haft actually went into, and all the rolls of oozing fat enveloped around the blade and around that haft, and Ehud couldn't pull it out. It was stuck. It remained inside that fat, fleshly man, king's sin. It stayed in there, brethren and sisters, and out came all the disgusting intestines and everything else that resided in that bulk of a man. Now, God's giving us this information, quite graphic, for a reason. He wants us to understand not so much the graphic picture that's been taken place here, but what it actually means to you and me. That's what God is telling us. I'm going to finish the story fairly quickly, because we really need to have a quick look at some of the lessons for us today. Well, the story finishes, of course, with Ehud having killed the king. His bolt falls down onto the ground. He can't get the dagger out. The evidence is there. He can't get it out, so he's just got to leave it there. So what's he going to do now? Well, the record tells us in verse 23 that he turns around and he rushes out through the porch. Obviously, the servants are down somewhere else. He flicks the little latch on the back of the door, the push button, and pulls the door shut, and it locks behind him. And he just walks out as if everything is quite normal, past the servants, past the guards, and he's heading off up to the mountains of Ephraim, because the battle's not finished yet. The battle's not finished. Meanwhile, 1 hour later, maybe 90 minutes, 2 hours later, the servants are gathering around the summer parlour of the king. By this stage, he'd be ringing the bell wanting more food. And there's no noise. There's nothing going on inside. What's happening in there? I can't hear anything. And they make this little comment that, shall we go in or shan't we? It's a little bit of humour here. They're nudging, you go. No, you go. No, I'm not going, because he could be on the toilet. That's what it says. He could be on the toilet. I am not going in. So they let a lot of time go past. And that gives Ehud a great deal of time to escape where he needs to escape, and to raise the alarm that victory so far has happened, but it's not over yet. And of course, he comes up into the mountains of Ephraim. He blows the shofar horn. So people were ready for this. They didn't just come down and say, what'd you blow that for? What's happened? They come down in verse 27, the children of Israel. They race down to tackle the Moabites in verse 28. And verse 29 says that 10,000 Moabites were killed. Now have a look at the type of Moabites that were killed. And they slew of Moab at that time about 10,000 men, all fat. They were all fat men, but they're still men of valour. That's telling us something, isn't it? You know, flesh is disgusting. We're born with it. We know how bad it is. You know, it absorbs all the filth of the world. We know how difficult it is to keep it out. And we can get very fat with fleshly things. But don't ever think that weakens the flesh, brothers and sisters. That doesn't weaken the flesh at all. It strengthens it. These men were fat, but they're still men of valour. They could still fight a good battle. Don't ever think that flesh is weak, brothers and sisters. It's not. And they were able to destroy the Moabites on that particular occasion. And in verse 30, of course, we have the rescue mission accomplished. Moab is subdued on that particular day at the hand of Israel, really the hand of God. And the land had rest for 80 years. This is a pretty amazing rescue effort that went on here. This had a great success as far as God was concerned, because it wasn't just Ehud, it was the people as well that joined into the battle. So that's the story of Ehud. Now, I know we've glossed over this very quickly, but I didn't want to go into the nitty-gritty details of, you know, where all these things happen, show you on maps and all this, because I want to go now into the significance of the story of Ehud. And this is very, very important. I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. We'll put up this flow chart of what happened in the story, which we all know about. Eglon ruled over Israel. Eglon was a rich, proud man who relaxed in his comfortable parlour. Eglon was mortally wounded when a two-edged dagger was thrust deep into him. The two-edged dagger could not be withdrawn. The battle was only won when Israel was united against the enemy. So there's what we've just dealt with, in a story form, in an event form, with throwing a few little lessons for us. But let's have a look at this, because you know where I'm going with this. I know you all know where I'm going with it, but we need to just go over it again. Flesh rules in human nature, brothers and sisters. There was only one exception, and that was the Lord Jesus Christ. He never allowed his flesh to rule his mind. He never allowed the propensities and the lusts of the flesh, the lusts of human nature, to guide him. He never even thought an evil thought. But other than that, you and me, flesh is inherently ruling our human nature. And I don't know about you, but I know I've said this before, but we have to acknowledge that flesh is very strong. If we think that we're stronger than flesh, we do live on another planet. If we thought that we could be like the Lord Jesus Christ, then you're going down the pattern of believing clean flesh. That is, if we can be righteous for 5 minutes, we can be righteous for a day. If we can be righteous for a day, we can be righteous for a week, and not allow flesh at all to ever control our mind. Just thinking like that, we've sinned, because it's not possible to be able to do that. So this is not just a dramatic story, brothers and sisters. It has relevance to you and to me. And flesh has unprecedented power. As I said, I don't need to remind you about that. You know what David said? David said, "Countless evils have surrounded me. My sins have caught up with me so that I can no longer see. They outnumber the hairs on my head. I've lost heart." On one hand, David recognises his own sins. On the other hand, he says, you know, God is my meditation. The law is my meditation day and night. Well, let me tell you something. Let me tell you when flesh really got hold of David. When he was up there on the rooftop one day, and he should have been probably out there in the battle, but he wasn't, and he was relaxing. Might have had a glass of wine or two, and he sees this beautiful woman bathing next door. And that turned into an absolute ugly event in his life and in the life of his family from that moment on. Flesh takes control of you, brothers and sisters. Look what the Apostle Paul says. I don't do the good that I want to do. He says, instead I do evil that I don't want to do. I don't want to do evil, but I do it. It's hard to imagine that Paul said that, isn't it? But he did. He said, sin that lives in me is doing this. I'm born under the condemnation of human nature. All those propensities that I've got are causing me to do this. But of course he fought that, didn't he? We know he fought it. So it's very important that we understand how strong flesh is in our life. Second point. Flesh is proud, it seeks for a comfortable, lazy life of ease and wealth. That's what flesh is. It's all about self, self, self. The soul of the sluggard, it craves. It gets nothing, but it just craves ease and wealth and so on. do your best, the opposite is, of course, do your best to present to God as one approved, as a worker that need not be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. Now, you know where I'm going with this one here. Flesh can only be dealt with the deep cutting power of the two-edged sword of the Spirit. What quote am I going to put up here? Well done, Ross. Hebrews 4:12. We won't go to it. I've got it on a slide to save time. Hebrews 4 verse 12. What does it say? The word of God is living and active. It's sharper than any double-edged sword. It penetrates even to the dividing of the soul and the spirit, the joints and the marrow. That is, when it gets stuck right into our flesh, it will cut everything out. That's what it's designed to do. Anything to do with the propensities of human nature, let the sword of the Spirit loose. It's it's sharper than Ehud's sword. It will get stuck into us, you, me, and it will divide asunder all of those things that are within us, the propensities. And it will discern and judge the thoughts and the attitudes of the heart. And we know that the sword of the Spirit is the Word of God. It's this book here, brothers and sisters. That's what it's all about. So you see, the sword of the Spirit is very much aligned with Ehud's two-edged dagger that he had. So, brothers and sisters, we have to have the Word of God continuously working in our life. And that brings us to the next point. And this is something which I think you'll find interesting, hopefully. That sword didn't come out. The two-edged sword must be used continuously. You cannot just use it every now and again. Now, Brother Steve did a fantastic exhort on Sunday. And it was a really good exhort because it made me think very much about my life, as it did all of us. And I'm sure everyone that heard it felt the same way, because it's so easy to have this as not a full-time part of our life. We're about to go on holidays, son. We're almost ready to go on holidays. This is our last class for the year. I don't think there's too many lectures left for the year. We've got, obviously, our memorial meetings, but a lot of us are going to go on holidays. We're going to go away, and we're probably not going to really come back and see a lot of each other until beginning of February next year. Are we taking this with us in our life over the holiday period? As Brother Steve said, how is our lamp? Is it got much oil in it? Does it need topping up? Is the flame flickering, or has it gone out? Well, we're coming up to a very dangerous period where this can be, well, guess what? Everything's finished. Put that down, I'll pick that up in February. Oh, February's here. Okay, better get it out again. Brush off the dust, we're back to it again. You see, brothers and sisters, we are coming up to a very dangerous period in our time, in our life, and we need to understand that throughout our entire life, that sword has to stay in us. It didn't come out of Eglon. It's got to stay within us. That word of the Lord must be used continuously in us, not just every now and again. And I think that's very important that we understand that. So the battle against the flesh is both an individual one and a collective one. So the two aspects of Ehud's success wasn't just his own personal success. Yes, that initiated it. That was the catalyst. But it's also a collective one. He had other people that helped him win the battle on the day. We know that certainly as far as our battle is concerned, yes, it is an individual battle. We're judged as individuals when we get to the judgment seat. But I tell you what, we can do an awful lot this side of the kingdom to help each other fight that battle. It's not an easy battle. And I am so thankful when I look out into this audience that there are brothers and sisters here that have helped me in my battle. And they probably don't even know it, but they have. It's a collective thing, brothers and sisters. We cannot do it alone. And the success of that day was based very much on the fact that, yes, Ehud took the lead. Yes, Ehud showed a faith. He was a valiant man. He was an honourable man of God. And he was able to kick-start that process off. But it was the rest that joined in to help make it all happen.